Welcome back to Echo Mind Documentaries. If this is your first time here, subscribe, like, share, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Every phone in your pocket, every shoe on your foot, every cable behind your television, somewhere on all of it, there are three words: Made in China. But how did that happen? And what did it actually cost? In less than 40 years, a country with no running water in most of its villages became the manufacturing engine that powers the entire modern world. This is not a story about luck. It is a story about decisions, desperation, and a gamble that changed civilization. For decades, China was a country closed to the world. Its people worked the land under a system that left little room for individual ambition or private enterprise. Cities were sparse. Factories were state-owned and deeply inefficient. The idea that this nation would one day manufacture the majority of the world's consumer goods was not just unlikely, it was unthinkable. Then, in 1978, a man named Deng Xiaoping changed the rules. Deng had watched China suffer through years of rigid ideology and economic stagnation. He was pragmatic in a way that made him dangerous to the old order. He did not care whether an idea was communist or capitalist. He cared whether it worked. He famously said, "It does not matter whether a cat is black or white as long as it catches mice." That philosophy would reshape a civilization. The reforms he introduced were methodical and surgical. First, he dismantled the collective farming system and allowed rural households to sell surplus crops on the open market. For millions of peasant farmers, this was the first time in their lives that extra effort translated into extra income. Food production surged, hunger began to recede, and something else began to stir: ambition. Then came the special economic zones. In 1980, 4 coastal regions, including a small fishing village called Shenzhen, were designated as testing grounds for foreign investment and market economics. These zones were deliberately isolated from the rest of the country. They were experiments, and the results were staggering. Foreign companies, mostly from Hong Kong, Taiwan, Japan, and the United States, arrived with capital and contracts. What they found in China was a workforce unlike anything available anywhere else on Earth. Hundreds of millions of people who needed work, who were disciplined, who were willing to work long hours for wages that made manufacturing in the West economically impossible to justify. The math was brutal and simple. Through the 1980s, factories multiplied across the Chinese coast. Light manufacturing led the way. Toys, textiles, shoes, and simple electronics flowed out of newly constructed industrial towns. Villages became cities almost overnight. The migration from rural areas to factory towns represented the largest internal human movement in recorded history. Somewhere between 200 and 300 million people relocated in search of wages. The conditions inside many of those factories were severe. Workers lived in dormitories stacked with bunks. Their days were governed by production quotas and factory bells. They sent money home to parents and children they might not see for months at a time. They were building a new China, though most of them were simply trying to survive the week. But survival was producing something extraordinary. With each passing decade, China was not just manufacturing more, it was manufacturing better. Engineers trained at state universities cycled into factory floors. Processes were refined, supply chains were compressed. A producer in Shenzhen could source a component, assemble a product, and ship it to a port in less time than a Western competitor could schedule a meeting. Then came the defining moment. In 2001, China was admitted to the World Trade Organization. This was not simply a trade agreement, it was an invitation into the global economic order. Tariffs fell. Markets opened. Western corporations, already familiar with Chinese manufacturing costs, now had even fewer barriers to moving their production offshore. The flood became a surge. American factories closed. European textile industries collapsed. Entire industrial towns in the Midwest and the English Midlands hollowed out. The debate about whether this was globalization working as intended or a catastrophe for working people in the West would continue for decades, but the economic arithmetic was undeniable. China was cheaper, faster, and increasingly more capable. By the mid-2000s, China had moved beyond light manufacturing. It was producing steel,
automobiles, semiconductors, and pharmaceuticals. It was building the infrastructure to sustain its own growth at a pace that left development economists struggling to find historical comparisons. A new highway every few weeks, a new city every few months. The country was in a state of permanent construction. The port of Shanghai became the busiest in the world. Shenzhen, that fishing village from 1980, grew into a megalopolis of over 13 million people and became the hardware capital of the planet. If you wanted to prototype an electronic device, you could do it in Shenzhen in days. The same process in Silicon Valley would take months. The density of suppliers, assemblers, tool makers, and logistics operators that had accumulated in that one city represented a competitive advantage that money alone could not replicate overnight. Behind all of this was a government that played the long game. Beijing did not simply allow the market to operate freely, it guided it. State banks directed credit to strategic industries. Currency policy kept Chinese exports competitively priced. Infrastructure investment ran decades ahead of demand, and a policy of requiring foreign companies to partner with Chinese firms meant that technology transfer was built into the cost of market access. China was not just manufacturing foreign products, it was learning from them. By 2010, China overtook Japan to become the world's second largest economy. By 2013, it surpassed the United States as the world's largest trading nation. The factory of the world was no longer a title given from the outside. It was a role China had engineered for itself with extraordinary precision. But the transformation carried its contradictions. Pollution in industrial cities reached levels that were difficult to comprehend. Rivers ran with chemical dye. Air quality in Beijing became an international story. Inequality grew as factory owners accumulated wealth while many workers remained trapped in low-wage cycles, unable to afford housing in the cities they had built. And the one-child policy, introduced during the same reform era, created a demographic structure that economists now warn will challenge China's labor supply in the decades ahead. The workforce that made China's rise possible is aging. Wages have risen to the point where some manufacturers are beginning to relocate to Vietnam, Bangladesh, and Ethiopia. China, aware of this trajectory, has been moving up the value chain. It is no longer content to assemble iPhones, it wants to design them. The Made in China 2025 initiative signaled Beijing's intention to dominate industries like artificial intelligence, robotics, and aerospace. Whether the next chapter of that story unfolds as planned depends on forces that are genuinely uncertain. Trade tensions with the United States, geopolitical friction over Taiwan, a domestic property sector that accumulated debts on a historic scale, a global shift towards supply chain resilience that governments are now actively funding. What is not uncertain is what already happened. In less than half a century, China transformed from an agrarian nation on the edge of famine into the manufacturing center of human civilization. The scale of that shift has no modern parallel. It changed the price of nearly everything you have ever bought. It reshaped the politics and economics of every major nation on Earth, and it was not an accident. It was a decision, made deliberately, executed patiently, and sustained across generations of sacrifice that most people outside of China will never fully understand.